So it'd be interesting to have Hitler's model of self.
You can learn more about life by visiting graveyards and understanding what it means to start and end life.
The root cause of suffering is attachment. I see that as the creation of abstractions in the world that we create.
We're all children of the sun. We're all created from stardust. There's 3.5 billion years plus of life that taught us the things that we need to survive in this environment.
So I took an example of general relativity, and I kind of explored all of the underlying assumptions behind that, where you can fractalize any belief into its underlying assumptions and then take a perspective and investigate how a perspective might work with those assumptions.
Everyone's the hero of their own story, and they go through some experience that transforms their beliefs or their perspectives somehow. If you could go back into history, and maybe even today, any historical figure, any person that ever existed, if you can create a personalized belief model, who would it be and why? Hey, everybody. Welcome to the ABCs for Building the Future podcast, where we host people doing big things with big stories to tell. So this is a team episode. So we have the co-founders of Epistemic Me working on our project. We're going to start off by talking through some project updates. We have some exciting launch plans to go over. And then we're going to get into a segment of the show, which we're going to call Get to Know the Founders. In the first few episodes of our podcast that we're going to run on a recurring basis, we want to spend some time just building community and introducing ourselves and really our why behind everything. And so we have a segment of this podcast solely dedicated to getting to know. And then we're going to go into something we always do amongst us, which is brainstorming and riffing on application ideas and problems to solve and solutioning. We have I like to think of our scrappy team as very hackery, dynamic, scrappy, agile. So I'm really excited for this portion, and I think folks will be too. So first thing I'll go over is some project updates. So we have our launch date for next Monday, the 6th. Once this podcast is out, this might be in the past by that point. We have our marketing launch, the newsletter launch, and this podcast launch, as well as open sourcing Epistemic Me as an SDK GitHub project where people can contribute. So we're really excited for that. Partnership channel development is going really well at the moment. Connecting with Brian Johnson and his Don't Die community, it really seems like we have a pretty good understanding of or at least a good forming understanding of our ideal customer profile at this point with an application use case we plan to go to market with, healthboost.ai. And we've done a round of user testing. So in the past month, we've gotten an idea from concept into users' hands in a Figma prototype into validated design decisions. So we're rapidly testing more and more. And we hope to connect with Brian in the next couple of weeks to give him a pitch about some of the concepts that we're building that could possibly help his community. Jonathan and I are also going to be going to a longevity summit ran at Stanford University with leading experts around longevity, researchers, scientists, potentially developers. And we plan to build more partners and alliances and beef up our network of potential contributors to the project, either from an advisory lens or from an actual development lens. Either you're an application developer or infrastructure developer and you want to work on the SDK. So lots of things going on. Even since the last podcast, this is not even half of this stuff. And then Deen and Jonathan have some stuff to cover too on the product and technology side. I'll pass it to Jonathan first for a quick update, and then Deen after that, and then we'll get into the Get to Know the Founders.
Cool. So yeah, an update on Epistemic Me and our gearing up for release. I think we've made some nice progress where we have this API built in Go, and we have SDKs that we've prototyped with Python and TypeScript and Go now, and we're looking to release an example of use of the TypeScript SDK in a chat-like application. And so I call it a chat survey because it's a little bit of a restricted kind of chat where the system asks you a question, you give an answer, and then the SDK extracts your beliefs from the conversation. We call them dialectic interactions. And so that's been a lot of fun. And it's been a lot of fun to kind of bring Epistemic Me into the form factor of a chat interface. That wasn't the initial idea, actually, but it just seemed kind of like the most organic way that we could demonstrate the capabilities alongside, what we're trying to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Super exciting stuff. Deen, want to give a quick update?
Yeah, sure. So working on a couple things right now. Before release, want to make sure that our contribution guidelines are in good working order so that folks have a good path to figure out how to contribute. On the backend side, doing a bit of refactoring so that we can get the system to work beyond the dialectic interaction. So prototyping some concepts of a generalized epistemology that will work with predictive processing and some other new forms of investigating and working with the beliefs that might work better for the perspective taker. So one of the examples of that I was prototyping yesterday was a way to examine the assumptions in any given belief. So I took an example of general relativity, and I kind of like explored all of the underlying assumptions behind that. It was a really cool experience, and I think that's something I'd like to build out with the perspective taker, where you can fractalize any belief into its underlying assumptions, and then take a perspective and investigate how a perspective might work with those assumptions. So that's something I might try to prototype on the front end. I don't know if that's going to be ready for release. Maybe we'll have a mock in JSON, but the backend work for that's looking pretty good.
Cool. Well, just for the audience, could you talk a little bit more about perspective taker? For anybody that, is new, obviously new to our podcast, maybe doesn't understand the data model. We haven't launched yet. Once we do, we'll have a video to explain that. But like real quick, just on the pod, if you can give a quick take on perspective taker, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, the basic idea is that there's tons of content in the world who are trying to help folks. They're producing and all of those have an underlying perspective that they're trying to get to the world. I know, Robert, you're one of those content creators with your ABCs for Growth podcast. The idea would be, how do we take perspectives that someone has in their writing or their form of media, and how can we inject that into Epistemic Me so that someone else could use their perspective to better understand any other given topic? And I think that pairs well with Epistemic Me, because Epistemic Me is one about figuring out how to explore beliefs or update beliefs, and then maybe even make predictions off of those beliefs. But we also have an opportunity to say, as I'm doing that investigation, as I'm changing my beliefs, how can I take in other perspectives and modify the path that an epistemology might take, to put it in more philosophical terms? But the basic idea is, how do I take an influencer's perspective and have that change the way in which I update my own beliefs?
Very cool. Yeah, this podcast is all about building in the open. So we're very open about where we're at with generally everything, like where things are in the ideation phase, design phase, brainstorming phase, or actual implementation. So during the initial parts of the podcast, and maybe the format might evolve in the future, we will be giving regular updates of growing our beloved open source project and venture, Epistemic Me. So this was a quick taste of that. As the show goes on, we'll probably be adding the show notes, different resources and stuff like that. So got to figure that out. We're in the early stages, but this has been good to get that update. We have so many things that are in flight, and I'm really stoked to get the launch across the finish line and get that propagated throughout our networks so that we could get more contributors to the project and get more use cases going. So I'm pretty stoked for all the hard work that the team has put in, and we're very excited to launch. So getting to know the founders. So we have Jonathan here, Deen here, Robert, that's me. I'm the one blabbing right now. I know we talked a little bit about our backgrounds last time. Like Deen talked about how he's a lead engineer at Stripe. Jonathan's a serial entrepreneur. I'm like a product leader. I've also been an entrepreneur. This is my second venture. But one of the big things about growing Epistemic Me to our team is about growing community around this, like a community of like-minded individuals that want to bring in the ideas around, how do we acquire knowledge? How do we change our perception of the world based on things happening in reality? How do we take unstructured data about how a human views the world through their content, like Deen was just talking about, or through a chat interface, and then structure that into a belief system? Those are the things that we seek to solve. And, we feel very strongly about that. And obviously the strength of those feelings come a lot from, I think, like nature and nurture at the end of the day. So it's like our backgrounds, right? So this section is really to get to know us. So I'm going to be facilitating a little bit around Jonathan and Deen, and then I'll answer some questions as I facilitate too, from my perspective. So first question, because this is all about beliefs, epistemic me, all belief systems, and we believe like all of reality comes from our beliefs. What is one belief you held strongly 5 years ago? Maybe I'll even expand it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that has completely shifted today, like a very cornerstone change of thinking for you. And then what caused that change? Anybody feel strongly top of mind, Dean or Jonathan, want to start?
I'm happy to go first.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, I believe the change of the last 5 years. I think seeing what OpenAI did in terms of taking transformers and adding a whole lot of data and a whole lot of compute, and then creating a large language model that was actually useful, really shifted my beliefs in terms of like how. Well, I've used a philosophical background on how I view technology evolution, and I think the direction that analytic philosophy took as it influenced technology throughout the ages, in particular with like computation, there was kind of like a debate in AI about the connectionist versus like the symbolicist, right? And what kind of approach of modeling the world would yield the best results. And this idea with the connectionist, manifests itself in the transformer as this idea that you can just cluster the words on a piece of paper, in the patterns on a piece of paper to describe the world. And I'd always thought of language being more helpfully described in terms of like how it's used in a cultural context and how it's sort of like used in a phenomenological context. And I thought surely that was sort of like the next big innovation that we would see. But I think that assumption was proven wrong in that the transformer-based systems at scale just did things and gave us a level of like functioning utility and predictability that I didn't see coming in this sort of time frame. And I think like I'm happy to be wrong and happy to update my beliefs and to see this kind of progress and then to build on it. But I'm still kind of like waiting for this where we can evolve the language through phenomenological sort of like constructs and this next wave too. And I think that's a bit of what Epistemic Me is about.
Could you say more about that thing at the end, how this is connected to epistemic me and how this is a bit about what EM is about?
Yeah, at least in the epistemological context that I use, epistemic me is really about modeling beliefs that are phenomenological, meaning that they come back to our sensory perception, they come back to our experience, and they're not abstract. And I think that's important as we relate to humans because that's what we have in common, or at least kind of like common sensory apparatuses. And if we talk to each other about beliefs in only abstract language, it leaves room for ambiguity and we don't understand each other very well. I think it's like a flaw in language that we don't really have ironed out yet. So, but if we can bring our scientific observations, our human experiences back to phenomenological context, then we can replicate, we can reproduce, we can take one another's perspectives more effectively, and we can disambiguate language in sort of like a more meaningful way. So that's, it's been an underlying theory of like how I see language, from a philosophical point of view for a while. And I think it's embodying itself in epistemic me. It's like one instantiation of that belief.
Cool. Dean, I see your face and I feel like you got things to say. Do you want to add on to what Jonathan was saying?
Yeah, I think I'll probably go in a different direction, maybe than what Jonathan was saying, and probably talk more internal as it relates to my meditation practice, which started around like 3 years ago. And I think the big change in beliefs is really what a lot of people talk about when they first get into these kind of practices. It's often communicated as like, you are not your thoughts or something of that degree. I would say it's more so the ability to shift between the belief that reality is external to me. Sorry, it looks like a fire alarm is going off in the background. Versus the fact that I think it's just someone cooking, so it should be put out soon, not to worry, listeners. Versus that reality is purely internal to me. I think, Robert, you mentioned this early on, the fact that beliefs shape our reality, that as a statement, I don't believe necessarily to be wholly true, but it's something that we can kind of opt into when it best suits us. And I think this is a common theme in a lot of Eastern spirituality. It's also seems to be an idea that's communicated in ideas like predictive processing. That's kind of how Jonathan and I started talking about epistemic me. It's also an idea that is kind of featured heavily in reinforcement learning, that an agent can only make sense of its environment through the events that the environment is producing, not necessarily the environment itself. And this is also a very like Kantian idea from a philosophical perspective. But really, it's that idea to say that to shift between the perspective that my beliefs are generating reality and that reality is external to me, provides a much better way of navigating the world in terms of how much suffering you're experiencing and your ability to be connected to the rest of the world. So it's almost, in a way, the belief in the ontological primitive, to put it in really philosophical terms, the ability to switch between that.
Could you say more about navigating life in the world with less suffering? That caught
Yeah.
my attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think suffering is one of those really hard words to describe because it means so many things to different people. But if I were to define it, it would be um, not equivalent to pain, because pain is a sensory emotion, but the way in which our thoughts react to pain and try and interpret that pain. That oftentimes is a function of our beliefs about pain, or our beliefs about the causes that we believe lead to that pain, and can lead to these kind of thought loops or cycles in which we perpetuate more suffering or the interpretation of pain upon ourselves. The Buddha famously said that the root cause of suffering is attachment. I see that as the creation of abstractions in the world that we create. So the mind's tendency to need to draw fine lines and boundaries between things often prevents us from seeing the true interconnectedness of things. And in the context of thoughts, it's oftentimes the fact that we draw abstractions around things like pain and then try and draw cause and effects based off those abstractions. If we see those things as inherently empty, oftentimes we can just exit the whole thought loop of suffering.
Yeah, it's really meta in that way, right? On the whole pain is different than suffering thing, I want to just add like something that I read from one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books. I forget which book, but he talked about an example story that showed the difference between pain and suffering. And he had somebody, I think, come to Plum Village. They had a cane and they had like kind of a kink in their step. And it was, I think, a hip problem, if I remember correctly. And they would complain about it all day to anybody that would listen. They would just say how much it sucked and it took away from their life. And they just really focused on how much it took from their life and how much it handicapped them and didn't allow them to do things they used to do. And then one day they had some sort of enlightenment and they realized like them focusing on that made it worse. Like, it's like, yes, sure, I have this kink in my step. Yes, it's kind of painful or whatever. But I let that pain go beyond the pain, the emotional pain in the moment, or even the neurological plane in the moment, to like actually make the rest of my experiences and interactions with people painful. And that part is what he called suffering, is like when you let it go beyond the neurological or just a feeling and you let it creep into your life like that. And so after he had this enlightenment, he just stopped complaining about it. And then all of a sudden he stopped walking with as much of a limp. And then all of a sudden he was a happier dude. So I think, and I think it's very apt that you bring up pain and suffering and the differences between and how beliefs are in between that. So it makes a lot of sense. So I just want to make sure like we're answering the question. So what is one belief you held strongly before that is now changed in relation to what you said?
Yeah, I think I would say it's really the idea that I am my physical body as opposed to my conscious experience. That's the one belief that changed. And that is a belief that connects to many other beliefs. And when that belief dropped away, led to many other beliefs dropping away as a result.
Like what? Like what?
Yeah. So if you look at this, kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the perspective taker, when we were talking about kind of the assumptions inherent in every conversation, in every sentence or belief that you make. You know, if you have a belief that says, I am in pain, there's an assumption there that I is referring to the body. Right. But if you take the perspective that I is not the body, I is conscious experience, suddenly the assumption that made up the larger belief goes away. And so does the higher level belief, or it needs to be reformed around a new assumption. So, and this is, I think, very pertinent to Epistemic Me, because the way Jonathan and I have been looking at beliefs is in the context of beliefs and belief systems that are like network of other beliefs. So oftentimes by pruning a single belief, you may end up changing the entire belief system as a whole. And that entire belief system, as you mentioned, can affect almost everything in your life.
That's so interesting. As you said that, I'm reminded of like other systems Like, I guess one question came to mind. Are there other systems like that where you take out one node or one element of the system and it changes drastically the entire other parts of the system? Like, imagine a rainforest or some other sensitive ecosystem, a pond maybe with a certain amount of tadpoles and stuff. But it's interesting. Like, go ahead.
There's this really great book I recommend for folks at home. I'm just going to look up the author's name. I think it's Donna Meadows. It's called Thinking in Systems. So the entire book is really this, and she talks about how many different systems that you might see in the world, like economies or even like
Political systems, like
political systems, ecosystems can be decomposed into these series of inputs and outputs, and then reinforcing loops as outputs go back into inputs. So oftentimes, when trying to understand systems, you need to think about the relationships that are occurring, and oftentimes, like a single input may lead to a certain delay that cascades into a huge reinforcing loop. So it's this taking this kind of interconnected look at systems. I'm not doing the book justice, but I recommend people go read it.
I'll add something to that book. It is such a great book, and it's only like 150 pages or so, but what it gives you is information architecture and an ontology to talk about any system. A system could even be co-founders on a startup, right? It could be like that. Let's take that example. It's like, I'm sure other founders listening to this have had experiences where you probably have problems with your co-founder. You have a disagreement. That is inflow of bad feelings, right? And then you might have an inventory of resentment or a stock of resentment that goes up over time.
Yeah.
So how do you decrease that? Well, you probably have a healthy, mature adult conversation about your feelings on the matter and get past it, make decisions, move forward, like stuff like that, right? So similar in like intimate relationship problems, or similar in working in a political system or whatever. Like, there's inflow, there's outflow, there's inputs, there's outputs. And so it's really interesting to read a book that is solely dedicated to systems, and you could totally use it for even mental health use cases. Like, one example is I might increase the amount of negative mental health points. Let's just say that that's a number that quantifies how good my mental health is. Let's say it's negative. It's at a threshold that's bad. How do I accumulate positive health points? Like, go to therapy, meditate. Like, that's another way to increase the inventory or stock of good mental game, almost, to put in simplistic terms. But I absolutely love that book. So Deen, great shout out. So, okay. So Deen, you were saying separating the physical self from the conscious self. That was like the big belief change that you had. Thanks for finishing.
Yeah, the identification of what I am. And that's not to say it happens all the time, but at times it does happen, and it's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. When we're feeling enlightened.
Exactly.
So for me, I guess Jonathan went with like the technology entrepreneurship route. Deen went more like internal. I'll say internal too. One thing that I learned, I think 8 years ago or so, my dog had just died. So I actually, weirdly enough, another dog of mine just recently passed away. And at the time, 8 years ago, I had just started therapy and I wasn't super skilled at explaining my emotions. And I was really good at just bottling it all up and repressing it. I was really bad at not doing that. And so a friend of mine changed my whole belief about it. So my belief on sharing my feelings at the time were probably of the very toxic masculinity patriarchy belief of like, oh, I mean, who cares about my feelings, my bad feelings, or my bad feelings might be a burden to other people, or I don't want to burden other people with my problems. Like, everybody's already got their own problems, like, or I should just be a man about it, or I should toughen up or whatever. Like, I shouldn't cry about this, like that kind of thing. I remember it was a tough year. I had gone through a pretty bad breakup. I went through, my dog died. And then my brother got schizophrenia that year. And then my aunt got breast cancer. That was a bad year. And then I was launching a product at the same time. So I finally had enough. Like, I was like, oh my God, like, I'm losing it. I got to like tell somebody. So my friend Sam had been seeing me struggle. This is at work. We were launching a product together. She was another product manager. And she comes up to me. He's like, hey, like, I've noticed, we were just on a walk from one office building to another office building. This is pre-pandemic. And she was like, hey, I've noticed you've been having a hard time. And, you know, if you want to chat, I'm here. And I was like, yeah, like, actually, my dog just died. And then she was like, oh my God, tell me, like, she was a dog mom too. And talked about that. And then I felt safe enough to kind of talk about like, yeah, I also have all this other stuff that happened. So like my mind's not completely in it with this product. Right? And she says, holy crap, how long have you been dealing with this? And I was like, I don't know, past 6 months. She's like, how come you haven't said anything? We've been working together every day. And I'm like, well, I just don't want to burden people with my problems. And this is what she said. That changed my entire belief about sharing feelings and articulating your feelings and your problems to other people. He said, it is absolutely not a burden. It's actually a privilege to hold space, to understand your problems and your feelings about them so that I could feel more in touch with my own humanity. And then I came to realize like, oh, I've always loved being the go-to person for my friends. If they had problems, I would love to hold space for their feelings and stuff. But I always just had this very hypocritical view of my own feelings. That's probably driven from systemic biases and patriarchy and stuff. And then maybe a lack of like learning skills to communicate those things well and like my beliefs around them. So that completely changed everything. And I felt a lot better. And then I went to therapy and I was like asking more about like, how do I be vulnerable? How do I like articulate my feelings? And then I discovered things like the feelings wheel, and I discovered things like nonviolent communication and body scanning, like different techniques to understand your feelings. And then also to like bridge the gap of anxiety in my original belief that this is a bad thing to do. And weirdly enough, so grounding it in beliefs, it almost took repetition for me to like, it wasn't like, oh, I completely believe it right now. It was more like, I'm kind of curious now about this concept of sharing feelings. So I'm going to dabble. And then over time, it became, oh, 100% I believe that this is the right way to go about the world. Like 100% I believe that this is the healthy way to live life, to articulate your feelings, to share connection with other people. But yeah, that was just an interesting note on that personal discovery. It was like, it wasn't like 100%. There was that huge tipping point that like catalyzed that change from my beliefs. And then it took a lot of repetition of actually trying it and seeing this is a good thing. Like I'm not hurt by this. Like people take it well. And now I completely 100% believe it. That was a big belief change I've had that has highly changed my life for the better in the past 8 years or so. And I guess to close the loop, so I also just lost another dog recently. I laugh. It's not a funny matter, but I laugh because it's so like, I don't know. It's like we're in the Matrix. I'm like, I can't believe this happened again. And the reason I'm kind of talking about it like this is I remember back then I was so heartbroken over it. I didn't have the right tools to get through it. This time around, I had very healthy emotional skills, leaning on friends and so even my co-founders on this issue for emotional support. And I was able to get through the grieving process within like a week to get to a point of like, hey, I'm feeling happy again. So that belief system changed my entire life and my ability to bounce back and increased my resilience. So really big changes.
It's a great example.
Yeah, I'm glad you're able to get to that point. That's a very powerful example.
Dude, yeah. It's a lot of it is realizing a lot of, I guess, actuating a lot of Buddhist philosophy and concepts of just everything's temporal and then everything is connected. So did I really lose Nibbler? Because when I look around, there's all these other parts that I still have because of that love and relationship. Back then, I didn't have those words. I didn't have interconnectedness or no self or whatever. I was just like, fuck, I like lost things. And now I'm like, it's not so much a loss. It's more like I've gained something. I've maybe, consciously lost something in my day to day. My routine has changed. I don't go for a dog walk in the morning. So those things give me the very human, like heartstrings kind of pulls at like those pangs. But overall, I think learning that we're all connected and these skills, like changing my belief systems, I think has really helped me to bounce back this time, like way faster than I could have ever originally imagined. So, okay, next thing. That was a lot. It was great to kind of hear the changes in beliefs for each of us. This one's more of a fun one. If you could go back into history and maybe even today, like any historical figure, any person that ever existed, if you can create a personalized belief model using Epistemic Me, of course, for that historical figure, who would it be and why? And actually what's fun about this podcast is we can actually do things like this. Like we could actually like go get Marcus Aurelius's books and like go create this. Like that would be sick. So if the audience, you have historical figures that you might want to submit us a list or whatever, and you are there's interest in engaging with the model of self of a historical figure, let us know. And if there's enough interest, we might do it. Deen, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think someone I really admire is Albert Einstein. I think that, we often see him as being this like really intelligent figure, which he was, but I think he was also like a very brave individual. I think the way he went about coming up with the theories of special relativity and general relativity, they weren't done in the institution, right? They were done while he was an office clerk. They were done out of like pure love for science. He was also a very philosophically minded individual. He was like, I think he like read Kant at 13 or something. And then he eventually said something of the sort, like, the only God I believe in is the God of Spinoza. And to me, I see a lot of parallels with how you might think about certain ideas in Vedic philosophy and some of the ideas in Spinoza. So he's been a very inspirational figure to me. I love the way in which his theories were created. He kind of like, I wouldn't say he put aside evidence, but he kind of committed to this idea that mathematics can explain reality, right? And it's a very brave idea to say, I'm just going to sit with my thoughts and I'm going to construct this elaborate structure that for like the next 100 years, experimental evidence continues to prove correct. But I just created this purely within my mind. Like I learned like the secrets of the universe in many ways just through putting together mathematical equations. So people obviously appreciate the genius of Einstein. They say it's equivocal to genius, but I don't think people really appreciate what a feat that he actually accomplished. So yeah, I find him a very inspirational figure. I would love to create his belief system. I know he was also like an avid violinist, so I'm sure he had lots of thoughts about music, the role that music plays in creativity, how one should do science, how one should work with their thoughts, how that relates to philosophy. I just think if you created a model of self about him, it would be this very expansive figure who could talk about so many different domains and would really enrich your life.
Dude, we should do this. Like, that just convinced me right there. We should be doing this. Like, it sounds like we could make the world a better place if we made a little Einstein bot people could talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I heard someone on the Dwarkesh podcast, I think a physicist, was saying that his test for AGI was if you could create some agent and not give it information about modern day like science, could it recreate general relativity from scratch? That would be his test for AGI. I thought that was pretty.
Oh, that's a cool thought. That's a cool thought. That'd be a fun experiment.
Wow. Yeah.
That's really cool. Thanks, Deen. One follow-up question, Deen. Has Albert Einstein always been a big role model for you? Like ever since you could remember? Or?
No, I think a lot of that came maybe in the last 2 years. Yeah, I was always really kind of interested in math and computer science, but to me, I think my interest in meditation, which led to an interest in philosophy and made me realize how many of the greatest scientists were also deeply into philosophy, kind of led to this deep fascination with him.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks for sharing the origins of that. Also, another thing I'm kind of curious about for myself, but I think the audience would be as well. Like Dean's mentioned his meditation practice before. So I'm curious, what is your meditation practice real quick?
It's changed over the years. I think these days it's mostly like a do nothing practice where I just sit, and I'd also say maybe a mix of some vipassana ideas where you just examine what's coming up in conscious experience, try and understand what it is. Yeah, and just doing that again and again and just trying to concentrate on what is coming up in experience and trying to see relationships that exist between them.
Cool. And do you spend a few minutes every day generally? Just kind of checking in with yourself like this?
The time has changed over, I would say the time that led to the most growth was probably doing like 45 minutes to an hour a day for a long period of time. These days it's more of like 20 minutes and longer sessions on the weekends.
Cool. Like, so I have some experiences in my own meditation journey. I'm curious to kind of compare notes. So let's do that for a sec. So you said the greatest growth came from more 45 to an hour long sessions over a long period of time. How long was that period of time before you noticed significant changes?
I noticed the changes pretty immediately when I first started meditating. Within 10, 20 minutes, starting to get like pretty crazy phenomenological experiences, feeling like kind of like feelings of ecstasy and like emotions. And that just kind of led me to more deeply pursue that. I was like very
Yeah.
curious. It's like kind of earth shattering, like what is going on? And that just led
Yeah.
to sit more and more.
Cool. Because my experience was there was maybe let's say there's tiers of feelings, I suppose. So like if tier 1 is the highest tier, like I had maybe tier 2 levels of like stress relief feelings, anxiety relief feelings. And then after a certain amount of hours spent, it almost felt like a couple other things changed. Like if I had to quantify it, it's like time to reduce stress also got minimized. Like my ability to get to a place where I was just present, like that amount of time it took was smaller. And then ROI, if I could think of it that way, I know it's not a good way to think of mindfulness, but like ROI of my time spent became more effective over time. Like the amount of relief or the amount of interconnectedness and gratitude that I felt coming out of the session became greater over time. And then another data point I wanted to throw out there. So I read in this book, Search Inside Yourself, they like studied, there was a reference study, if I recall correctly. And they mentioned how they looked at the brains of the happiest people on earth. Like they did MRIs of people and they determined the happiest people on earth. I forget what parts of the brain, like, or what brain patterns or different brain morphology or whatever it looked like. But the happiest brains on earth turned out to belong to people that had greater than 10,000 hours meditated. And I was just like, oh, okay, I guess my new goal is 10,000 hours meditated. Like I saw that and I was immediately like, all right, setting a goal. It's a video game. How many minutes do I have to do a day? And when will I reach this goal? So then I forecasted it out like a math nerd. And I was like, well, if I did 30 minutes a day, at what age will I actually reach this goal and become transcendent? Like that's not the Buddhist actually way to do it, is to count these things and like care about a goal. But because I just did that for fun. And I was like, oh, okay, if I do 30 minutes a day for the rest of my life, when I'm around 60-ish, I could get there. So then I started thinking like, whoa, what if it's an hour? What if then I could achieve these effects sooner? Like, anyway, I just wanted to double click a little bit on meditation. So thanks for going there with me, Deen. Jonathan, want to talk to me about the historical figure you would choose?
Yeah, sure. I think it's better to explain how I think about answering this question than maybe pick somebody specifically. And I think because like all these historical figures, I mean, we know about them. We have their words in writing or we have observations about them, but embedded in that is a representation of their beliefs. And I think when I think about this question, I think about, well, how do we extract their beliefs in a way we can take their perspective and have them as a working model who can help us interpret their world. And I think like our own consciousness is sort of like we hold a lot of perspectives of people, ourselves, our family, our ancestry, our culture in our mind at once. And it's what allows us to be what we call human today. And I think, so when I interpret this question, I think about, if I could like perspective take anybody in history and have them as like a working model inside of my mind that helps me like make sense of something in the world, who would I pick? And so that's how I go about thinking about criteria. And, I think there's so many people who have lived these amazing, interesting lives. I would really look for people that lived at dynamic times that had rich experiences. I think about people like Darwin, for instance, who would informed his view of the world by getting to travel and see forms of life that maybe he's the first person that's ever seen these things, or at least put an observational lens to them. I think about a philosopher named Biko. He was pre-Enlightenment philosopher that sort of came up with his own, like, he didn't derive from anybody, or he didn't appear to derive from anybody. And he was kind of like Italian counterpart to Hume around the same time period, where they were both answering questions about anything and everything. I think, these kind of perspectives. I wrote down Heidegger because I think he lived at such an interesting time. He's arguably one of the best philosophers of the 20th century, except that he compromised almost everything that he stood for to become a Nazi, probably for his own survival. And I would love to like pull apart his actual beliefs and see how he dealt with like the inevitable conflict that politics brings onto lives, when you become like a public figure. And maybe one more I'll mention I wrote down was Schopenhauer, because we talked about suffering before. And I think he's kind of like the Western counterpart to the Buddhist mentality, which is that life is suffering. And I think when you contrast his contribution to philosophy versus Hegel, his arch enemy in like German philosophy, Hegel, who we use the word hypothesis from his philosophy. It's like he's such an influential philosopher, and Schopenhauer's like, this guy's just a clown who's copying the last guy before him, and so I think these are the kind of perspectives of just like unique points of view that can kind of just like make sense of things in times of dynamicism and change, and have their own like underlying principled points of view.
Yeah,
Aristotle also, would be another one. Yeah.
Okay, so you're coming at it from the perspective of like, who would be the best picks based on their experiences, their lived experiences, so dynamic times, and they had a broad range of experiences and depth of experiences that could inform interesting takes on large domains of topics.
Yeah, that would be, and that's, I think, reinforcing my own strengths. And I think somebody who may be better suited by having a set of specialists next to them might have a different strategy for what perspectives they take and who they would like bring around with them everywhere they went. That's how I like to think about it. Yeah.
It's kind of cool to think about like having a pocket philosopher to be like, hey, can you help me make sense of this? Like, all right, let me switch the lens a little bit. I don't like that one, or that didn't make sense to me, or whatever. Which is essentially what Epistemic Me can do. Like, it's built so that we can actually make that happen. That is really cool. It's cool to think of what we're building. I would have used earlier in my life. I mean, I'll use it now, but like, I kind of wish I had something like this much earlier in life. That's really interesting. Who was that philosopher you said that became a Nazi? I don't know that story. Could you tell a little bit more of that story for the audience?
Heidegger, yeah. He was a German philosopher. He was understudy or worked closely with Husserl, who was probably like one of the strongest advocates of phenomenological philosophy. Heidegger took things kind of his own way, and he became, just like, I think Hannah Arendt described him as a man, God among men. He just had such a like elevated status and way of thinking. Like some of the things he brought to the table, like he'd say you can learn more about life by visiting graveyards and like understanding what it means to like start and end life and seeing human life, and then sort of like the context of it in between. But he also really questioned language, and in a lot of his writing, he has these kind of like weird abstracted words that he's come up with to describe situations that are more precise than the German language or the English language, that he was writing at the time. So he was both like destroying language before postmodernism and recreating it, and he is also kind of like thinking about what it meant to be and become in terms that were deeper than a lot of the philosophers at the time. And then, like I said, towards the end of his career, he was kind of given this choice, like, do you want to stay in Germany? Because if so, you're a Nazi. His understudy, Hannah Arendt, left Germany and went to France during that time. And Heidegger stayed, joined the Nazi party, and sort of, was vilified, obviously, after that for having, supported the movement.
That's so interesting. Huh. Yeah, it would be interesting to like have an accurate model of him to even just get the scoop of like what was his perspective at the time. Even just like making those choices, like those are heavy choices, That's interesting. Cool.
I love that idea of like perspective shifts and trying to figure out what led to that. I think is really probably one of the more powerful things that you can do in Epistemic Me, right? Like what actually caused the shift is sometimes more useful than understanding a given belief at any given point in time, right? Because it speaks to the epistemology or the process that took place.
Mm-hmm.
While you were talking, I was also thinking about Wittgenstein, who I think had that profound shift between his first view of like the power of language and this is like his second view. I can't exactly remember them, but it's known for being such a profound shift in the way his philosophy worked. It would be so cool to model that temporal change in someone like Heidegger or Wittgenstein over time.
Yeah, that's a great example, because I think you could take early Wittgenstein, the beliefs of early Wittgenstein as one person, and the beliefs of later Wittgenstein as a different person, because a lot of the beliefs conflicted so strongly, and both of them would probably be like, strong, helpful advocates and, exploring philosophical problems.
Exactly. And like, what's the path from early Wittgenstein to late Wittgenstein, right? Like, what is that?
Yeah.
Like what breadth first search could I do to get to that point? That could be very interesting.
Yeah. That's interesting in itself. As you say that, Dean, it gets me thinking of like the concept of stories and how humans are hardwired to just remember stories. One example I always give is like, do you guys remember what you ate last Tuesday? Unless you're like a health nut and you eat the same thing every day, Tuesday. I'm looking at you, Jonathan. You probably do. And I'm the same way. You probably don't remember. Most people would not remember. But if I ask you, like, do you remember the story of the tortoise and the hare? It's like learned that shit 40 years ago. Somehow you remember. And it's just that our brains are hardwired for that. And when I think of like the question of like what led to that change in perspective, oftentimes when I think about that question in my own life, it's a lot of like, I'm the hero of my own story. Everyone's the hero of their own story. And they go through some experience that transforms their beliefs or their perspectives somehow. Right. Like I even just told the thing earlier of my story of like went through a hard time. Friend gave me a sentence that I needed to hear at the right moment. And then it changed things. So it would be very fascinating to see like some of the most revered historical figures and be able to talk to them and even understand like what was the journey like for you to transform? Like what was your story? Like what happened to you to change your beliefs about something? So that would be super cool. And honestly, like the way Epistemic Me is built now, like we could theoretically interview somebody over the course of a few different podcasts with different exploratory questions and probably like actually figure that out. Yeah, that'd be cool. That's like a cool side quest we can go on. For my own answer, it's really hard. There's so many to pick. And as you guys were answering, I like juggled other answers in my head. I was like, oh shit, like now I have a different criteria for answering. So like I'll pick a very out there one. My original one was more vanilla, but this one is more out there because it was inspired by what Jonathan said, like just like have an intriguing person. So it'd be interesting to have Hitler's model of self. Like, why? How did his evil like manifest? Because obviously he's probably the hero of his own story. He probably saw himself as good. Like, how could he possibly have seen his philosophies or views as good or moral or ethical? Like, I'd be really curious to like tease apart his belief system to understand that. Is maybe shed a light on, like, you know, different personality disorders or potentially diseases, or like I'm thinking about grandiose narcissism, for example. Like I'm guessing that might apply to him, but I don't know. I like this is like our all armchair psychology stuff, but I do think that that would be really interesting. Like one of the people that is colloquially kind of decided as one of the most evil people of all time. It'd be very interesting to tease apart his belief system, and then that goes into literature for child psychology. So we never do anything that led to making a Hitler. You know, that's kind of where my mind's at. Any reactions on the Hitler pick?
Yeah, I think that's super fascinating. Sorry, to cut you off, Jonathan. I think what could also be interesting would be like, can I take examples of multiple evil people, right? Could I take, for example, Stalin, or could I take Hitler, or could I take, I don't know if people have emotional attachments to like Genghis Khan, but he did many evil things, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then I could create their belief systems and the assumptions that lead into their belief system. Maybe there's a set of core assumptions that all manifest into these larger belief systems. It's harder to pick apart when you look at Nazism in its specific cultural context. But what are the underlying things that may have produced similar or other kinds of bad philosophies? You know, one of them might be the willingness to view someone else as evil or yourself as better than someone else fundamentally, right? And we've seen that show up in many people who we revere as well, you know, throughout history. You know, nobody's perfect, including like our founding fathers, as we all know.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be super interesting to see the belief systems across individuals and what are the core assumptions that are shared and how does that manifest in different ways.
I wonder if this could be like a positive asset to academic research. Like, hey, if we just took all of the content that somebody like Hitler ever wrote, their journal entries, or whatever, and like dumped them into Epistemic Me in a more structured way, and then we gave you a chat interface to talk to it, this representation of them, would that be interesting in any way? Like, because now like Jonathan and I were like looking over a research paper. I think it was at a Google collaboration with some school where they like threw a bunch of very complicated AI prompts to have the AI role model different types of experts, like psychiatric experts, psychological experts, behavior experts, like whatever. They were able to basically, I think, what was it, 80% accuracy of what the person would answer next in an interview sort of format. And so I'm kind of curious if it's possible, it's proven possible that we could take some data from people and, you know, get 80% prediction on what they're going to say next based on some question answer format. Like, it seems probable to me that we can get some level of fidelity that's effective for, like, let's call it, the evil use case, like Hitler and all these other evil people. I wonder if that would be useful to academic researchers in any way. Like, can you guys think of some like ways that could be useful? It seems like a cool use case. I'd love to like ship that somehow. Like, if there is value to it, it sounds like there can be, but I'm not pinpointing exactly what.
Yeah, like red teaming with your Dr. Evil agent,
Yeah,
kind of there's that.
Yeah, so we're actually kind of prototyping something like this now, I would say, with like Epistemic Me. I think that yeah, I was playing around with the back end yesterday, and like basically I was trying to understand the belief of like of general relativity, as I was saying before. And I was like, well, what are the underlying assumptions that led Einstein to have this final belief? And it like gave me, okay, 3 underlying assumptions. And then I was able to fractalize those assumptions. And for each of those assumptions, I was able to look at the evidence, like the future scientific research that validated that. So I could see that being applied in a similar way to like Hitler's belief system. You say like he had that root thought that, not, I don't know what exactly you would describe his philosophy as, but then that would fractalize into these smaller belief systems, maybe one about the Aryan race or one about like the nature of genetics or all these different things. Then you could start to like fractalize that. There could be a different interface to explore that, like a chat system. I think one of the coolest ways to do it might be through this higher level kind of like inspection tool. Like for academics, I don't know about the academic use case per se, but I think from a curiosity perspective, I think a lot of people, I think that's what good academia is anyway.
Curious. Yeah.
Maybe some other people would say it has some other use case, which it actually does. But I think that's something I would love to do.
Yeah. I also, just for the audience, this is not a subtle Nazi podcast, by the way. We're not Nazis here. We're down this rabbit hole because we're talking about belief systems. And I just brought up the Hitler use case. It'd be very interesting to poke that apart and try to make the world a better place by understanding it. So just quick shout out, plug. We're definitely thinkers and tinkerers here. We're not, propagating Nazism. We have a lot of other questions in limited time. So let's keep moving forward. Looking ahead. Okay. This one's interesting. I'll change it a little bit, but this is about books. And again, this is more about like sharing a bit about ourselves and our backgrounds, what informs our beliefs. So do you guys have any, like, maybe instead of reading just one book, top 3 books that come to mind that have really shaped your beliefs and, how you go about the world, your worldviews?
Yeah, this is a tough one because there's a lot of different ways to answer the question. I think what I wrote down Joseph Henrich's books, The Secrets of Our Success and The Weirdest People in the World. One reason being because I think like I really like to look at myself as like, an accumulation of everything that brought me here. And I think that Henrich's books in particular, they talk about cumulative cultural evolution and the aspects of like how knowledge is transferred through cultures. And it really kind of gives you a concrete idea of how you are just a part of the culture that you're part of and like the behaviors that you take on. And one of the aspects he brings about in the book is like that the pre-modern mind, pre-modernity, before literacy, our brains work differently. They literally do MRIs with, in cultures that haven't been introduced to literacy yet, and they are symmetrical in nature, whereas cultures that are introduced to literacy have overweighted sort of visual cortexes where you can see a footprint on the left-hand side of the brain. And that's like, we're just like living this version of being human, in the last like 150 years or something like that. And I think if you think about like all of the ancestry that we carry with us and what we're recapitulating every day, like I try to carry that with me, and I think on a daily basis, just like how we're all children of the sun, we're all created from stardust. Like there's 3.5 billion years plus of life that taught us the things that we need to survive in this environment. and then all our immediate human ancestors and all the ideas and words and language they passed on. So I like to think about myself that way. And I thought the book was kind of like a nice encapsulation of that model. So where they're both, I wrote down Being You by Neil Seth, because I think his description of consciousness and like just resonated most with how I sort of like determined like, who I was as a person, was a really good one. And I think like in a practical way, like Atomic Habits is just kind of like that you are what you believe and what you have, how you act in your habits, like that bring your into everyday life. It's just a useful construct and a way to think about yourself and a way to grow as a person.
Love that. So we're all children of the sun and stardust, and we're interconnected. Don't forget that. And then the habits one. And then what was that other one that you said in the middle?
Being You by Neil Seth.
Being You.
And the first book was Joseph Henrich, The Weirdest People in the World.
Okay, gotcha. Cool. Okay, we'll aggregate this in the show notes when it comes out, so folks could get some of our book picks. Thanks for sharing, Jonathan. Dee, do you have any books you want to share?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, one book that was like super transformative for me was The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. And another one that I always keep around with me is like collection of dialogues from Plato and Plato's Republic together. Yeah, Plato, I think, especially book one of the Republic, was one of those moments where I felt like someone just kind of understood me deeply. For those who haven't read it, it's about Socrates. So Plato writes about Socrates. Like all we know about Socrates mostly comes from how his tutor, the person he tutored, Plato, wrote about him as a character in his works. And basically, Socrates is having this argument with the sophist called Thucydides, I think, about what is the nature of justice. And Thucydides basically proposes this idea of justice is the interest of the stronger. And what that really meant is like, do virtues like justice or goodness exist in of themselves, or are they just constructs that we use to kind of perpetuate our own needs in life, right? Do we pretend to be just so we can get what we want in today's society? And to me, it felt like that was one of the things I had struggled with the most. Was like, what is morality? Why am I good? Like, are other people just good because they're trying to get what they want? Do people actually believe in goodness? And it was so inspiring to see that someone had these thoughts so long ago. And for me, I always revisit that. And I just love the way Socrates engages. He comes off as a bit swarmy, but I think also he just has this perspective, just asking questions and letting the truth reveal itself as a process. So I love that as just a general way to live life. It's a place that you'll find many of these traditions going. It's a very blissful place to be, but it's not a very practical place to be. So like, what is practicality? So David Deutsch proposes this really interesting idea of truth that he kind of built off from Karl Popper. And he says that truth at any given time is the best explanation of the world that we have, right? So, and this allows for this idea of falsifiability, which is something that, Jonathan has built really well in Epistemic Me, which is I can treat something as true up till the point at which something proves that it's not the best explanation or that it's wrong. And then I can substitute that explanation for another truth. So it allows me to act within the world as if truth exists and with certainty, but also allows for truth to be updated over time. So it gives you that great optionality of grounding and constant pursuit of new knowledge. So it's a sort of epistemology of knowledge creation. Yeah, I just thought it was a really powerful way to look at the world. I thought it really made science very interesting to me. And I just love the way in which he kind of solves that problem of like, what is truth? And like, how do I now choose to be practical if I can deconstruct everything to nothing? Right. So it's like, I really loved his book. Yeah.
That's awesome. One question I had there about best explanation of the world at a given point in time. How do you define best in that question?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think it's like so he gives a couple of frameworks for thinking about that. So he talks a lot about like what are bad explanations. So this isn't me necessarily advocating his examples, but he gives an example of like why religions might be bad explanations of how the world works, because they're highly swappable with each other, right? You can easily change one religion with another and use its mythology to explain the world. So this idea, this ability of like variability in the explanation, if the explanation is highly variable with other explanations, then it's a bad explanation. But if you find it extremely hard to vary the explanation, right? So for example, why is Einstein's general theory of relativity a good explanation of the world? Is because there's no other explanation that explains all these concepts of like time dilation and why does gravity exist and all these things. Like we have no other explanation. It's the best explanation. So it is the truth up until someone unifies quantum gravity and comes up with a unified gravity. Yeah. So it's kind of that framework of thinking about the world.
I see. That's a good example. So a bad like he gives examples of bad explanations. So you might ascertain for yourself kind of generally what's a good explanation. That's super helpful. Because I was sitting over here thinking, well, best might be dependent on like the use case of like what you're trying to optimize. Like, for example, I was just thinking like I lost Nibbler and I was like, well, what's the best explanation for that? It's like, well, what's the one that like works best to get me past the grief? That's probably the best one. That's the working one that helps me. But like, it also depends what's best, how you define best. So anyway, sorry.
Sorry, just from like I think from like a Buddhist or meditative perspective, I think someone might say that trying to search for explanations in that context of suffering may just like lead to more and more suffering coming to be. I'm like more like a metaphysical scientific perspective. I think that's maybe where Deutsch's philosophy shines in how we do science, which may not apply to this context of suffering.
Yeah. This is, dude, it's so fun to talk to you guys. Like, I feel like I could just talk about this stuff all the time. Like, this is so fun. Thanks a lot, Deen. Very, very awesome recommendations. I definitely want to check out that latest book. So for me, crap, I just had it in my head. Hang on, I'm looking at my book. Oh, okay. Yeah. Like, how could I forget? The most influential book in my thinking, I read it when I was in college, maybe my second year, maybe third year, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. That like changed my entire trajectory. I feel like I was a really angry, younger child. And when I read that book, it just opened my eyes. I was like, whoa, this is the diary of one of the most powerful people in the world at one point. Like, that's crazy. Like, and I was reading it and I kind of just expected different things from the most powerful person in the world at a given point in time. Like, but it just talked about things like, I shouldn't be mad at people. And I was like, dude, me too. A lot of his writing comes down to just normal everyday stuff. Like, and I just gave it a reread this past year and I can confirm again, like almost greater than 50%, at least, my biased working memory was just like him parsing through how he is in control at all times. He should be able to respond, not react. And just like very stoic influenced mindset. One quote that he wrote that I really liked, and I put it in my journal, so I look at it every day. There is no retreat more peaceful and untroubled than a man's own mind. And I got that quote again this year. I don't remember reading that when I was like, 14 years ago, 13 years ago, but it made me double down on, let me get to 10,000 hours meditated. And for sure, this quote's true. For sure, it will be the most peaceful, untroubled place in the world, my own mind. So I see it as like a muscle to build to get to that quote realization. But yeah, the book was very helpful to get, because at the time I was really poor. So I was like, I just want to not be poor. Like I was operating from a very scarcity based mindset. So then to read from this guy that was like obviously one of the most rich, powerful people in the world that didn't have to think about being poor or paying rent or buying food to eat, like just seeing like some of his struggles were very similar. It's like, oh, I just want to be in control of my emotions. I want to master that. Like, and a lot of his quotes were just very timeless. Like I could read them and I know this will be applicable 1,000 years from now. And I think that's cool that we have his work. And there's even ones where he writes during war campaigns. And so just to get a window into the view of Roman emperor on a war campaign, and he's just thinking about like, okay, I need to be able to not yell at my subjects. Like he doesn't write it that way. He writes it more deeper, but a lot of it just comes down to just don't lose your shit. So anyway, that was probably one of my favorite books of all time. There are other books that have greatly influenced my thinking. Another one is How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. That gave me a pretty good framework for how to think about basically probably the biggest systemic force that we have affecting, I think, a lot of biases and stuff in society, capitalism. I think from everything I've read, and my thinking may evolve, my belief systems may evolve as I consume more material, but capitalism drives like a lot of things like social media, trying to eke out all the attention from a person on their phone or whatever. And then that's leading to, speaking of systems thinking, that inflow leads to a lot more anxiety and like suicidal thoughts and stuff for younger generations, right? And like another thing that's interesting is how I was talking to Jonathan about this, but like as of 2014 or 2013, for the first time in all of human history, more than 50% of intimacy or relationships come from apps, a capitalism byproduct, right? Not like I introduce you via family or friends or whatever, and more values-based matching. Now it's just like commodity. So yeah, I'd say those books have been pretty influential. So meditations, nonviolent communication is another one. Yeah. There's so many though. I'm like looking on my bookshelf. There's just almost too many. And I'm almost like, which one of these actually moved the needle the most? Do I even know? Like, is it just whatever comes top of mind right now? Anyway, so we'll probably be coming back to this in the future to give book recommendations. And if the audience has book recommendations, feel free. I think you can see this is a very like, you know, deep thinking kind of podcast and team. We're very philosophical by nature, very scientific. We are very just curious about the world. So if you have cool books, definitely hit us up and we'll add our book recs to the show notes. Okay, moving forward, this might be a really interesting question. So let's go with two out of these last ones, just because we don't have too much time. We have like 8 questions and we're already at an hour and 10. So let's try to go at hour and a half. And I think that'll be good for this cut. So one question, if Epistemic Me or SDK could only solve one major societal problem in the next 5 years, maybe 10 years, whatever, just like some big problem, what would you prioritize and why? Like more of a product management question for humanity at scale, but like curious what you guys think.
Uh, yeah, I think if like, there was unlimited budget or a reasonable budget, let's say, and a need to focus on one thing that would create an impact on society, I would say representation systems. I'd say the ability to represent individual subjectivity, to find people who are representative of other people, to find ways of doing real-time feedback with political decision making that can inform, the things that affect all of us, would be the thing that could change things. That's so needed, and it's sort of like it's something that we see every day and feel every day that's broken. That I think that understanding subjectivity could solve is representation systems.
So Jonathan, your answer is like, this is pervasive throughout all of society. Like this is leveraged. Every human being has a programmatic representation of themselves and it's leveraged in different solutions and stuff. And it helps to bridge our gaps of understanding of each other and leads to better, just like healthy living and productive, happy society. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can take it a little bit broader, actually. Like if,
Okay.
us as individuals can be broken down that we're a representation system of all the cells and organs and tissues that make us up, and they all have needs. And the better we can define the individual needs of those cells, the better we can represent ourselves, in a cultural context also. And then I think I'd also extend it if you think about like, all of human domestication and all of the animals, plants, everything that's in our supply chain, that every sentient being, that being part of a representation system, it brings ecology into the decision making, and it goes from short-term decisions based on like, very, very narrow mindsets into like what's holistically over a long period of time best for all of the sentient beings that we can account for. So I think representation systems can evolve very significantly, and they can solve the kind of problems that we all feel today.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Let's get that unlimited budget.
Yeah.
Um, Dean, do you want to go with your answer next?
Yeah, maybe I'll build off of Jonathan's response also with like maybe assuming an unlimited budget. Practically
It's fun that
speaking,
way. It's fun
you,
that way.
maybe if there's like a partnership like with like Apple or these like other device companies. I think the idea of like the model of self is the most sophisticated version of the identity problem that you so today I think the identity problem manifests itself in things like payments. I work in payments. So fraud is a big problem. How do you know who people really are, and how do you authenticate and prove how you really are? That actually has this huge impact on the global economy that we often don't see. This ability to actually maintain your own identity and be able to permission which parts of your identity are used in which way by which applications to do which things, and which information about yourself gets used in which ways. And then how does that identity update itself over time in a way that you control? I think is a really big problem. And I think, I don't think anyone's really solved it. And I don't know if it will be solved, because like it seems like the amount of information systems can process is just growing over time. And it seems like with these new applications like ChatGPT or other AI systems, they can extrapolate more and more information about you that you don't own at all. Like they completely centralize that information, and they can create the model and version of you that you don't control, which I think is a scary thing, because as you know, we emit tons of information into the internet, right? So there's so much about you that someone can now extrapolate and create, but you have no control over. So a way to build permissioned identity that works with these more sophisticated version of models of self, I think is something I'd love to build.
That'd be
I
really,
love it.
really interesting. Like own your own data about yourself holistically, be able to give permission. I'm like even thinking about like, what would the UX be for something like that? How would I explain to my grandma, hey, you could like change the permissions of what data you're giving Comcast or whatever the hell. And she'd be like, I don't think I care.
But I think Apple is doing the best job right now in the identity space, right? They've built
Yeah.
like these really sophisticated wallets. They've built Apple Pay. Apple Pay, getting to like a bit of payments nerd stuff right away. Like
Yeah, please.
they're overt for solving like the 3DS SCA problem, right? That right now
Could
is
you elaborate on that for people that don't know what that is?
strong customer
Including myself.
authentication. Strong customer authentication is basically this regulatory requirement in Europe, so that when you pay in Europe, you have to like log into your bank account to like prove that you are who you are, and it's like it forms itself in certain implementations like that are called like 3DS.
Okay.
Initially in its rollout in Europe, it was very poorly managed. That led to like tons of like merchant friction, and
Oh,
and basically, yeah, it costs friction, right, to prove who you are. But basically, what Apple's doing is like, because the whole like identity system is now built in with biometrics, you can now prove who you are at the point of payment, and kind of shift the whole way in which identity is proven at the point of payment. So it may end up solving that huge problem, which has historically taken some bips off the economy. So I think that's and then also, you can manage your subscriptions in Apple. Every single app you sign into, you can potentially route your email address to another email. And for example, with health applications, they have all this like drop down of health data that you can share or choose not to share, right? So they've built privacy and this idea of which information that you share very natively into the system. I think if that could be expanded to a model of self, I think there's a really cool, there's inspiration, or there's breadcrumbs that you could follow to take inspiration from how they've done it.
yeah. I'm kind of interested. Like now I'm
Interesting.
kind of curious.
Yeah.
Like I hadn't really thought about, because I'm not well versed into that problem that you just talked about, the strong
Yeah.
customer authentication problem. But that makes so much sense that in the way that Apple has architected their system, at point of purchase or sale that this person is that. That is interesting how just design of a broader system could solve like one really big gnarly pain point.
I think it has to be
Apple
done.
I was just
Sorry,
going to
go
say,
ahead.
Apple does seem well positioned then, like based on what you're saying. If they use Epistemic Me, they would be really well positioned to help people with this problem of let me permission things around my own beliefs, my own data. So that's cool. Sorry, what were you going to say, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, building off what you just said, and I think you don't want to end up with like the blue bubble, green bubble problem for identity,
No.
right? Where like they
Yeah.
just control the one way in which you authenticate yourself, right? Ideally, if there could be some standard, some model of self interface standard that gets published and is maintained by an authority, it could be Epistemic Me, that 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 interface can now be consumed on multiple different systems. It's a protocol in the same way TCP or other protocols are.
Yeah, totally.
You define the
Totally.
model of self protocol and the permission protocol into the interface. Then you could have multiple systems implemented. I think Mozilla might have operated under a similar model for some of its browser stuff.
That's a cool thought. That gets me thinking about so many things, and we just don't have enough time on this podcast. But I would love if, 10 years down the road, Epistemic Me's success is it is the de facto identity and permissioning protocol. Like that would be so cool. And then every application, every platform like leverage that. That'd be super cool. All right. 10 years, we're gonna revisit this podcast. It's gonna happen. There'll be one for the archives. So for me, I would, in terms of a major societal problem to solve, I suppose the most obvious one is like AI alignment. Like, I really don't think we will have AI alignment unless we could produce a programmatic representation of an individual self, like a human. Because like, how can we guarantee an AI really understands? Thought experiment is I have an AI assistant in my home. It's a robot. It helps me out. And then it's connected directly to my brain somehow. Let's just say that we've solved that. But if we haven't solved for how it not just connects to my brain, but actually understands me for who I am, then there's a non-zero percentage chance that it might take instructions the wrong way, or it just might not be aligned with me. In that thought experiment, I think the way that technology trends are going right now, I don't think anybody's really solving for that. I think we're solving for that. If other people are solving for it and you hear about them, please let us know. We'd love to like cooperate with this problem. Because as Deen says, I think this should be like a global, and in my words, I would call it like a public good. Like, I think that like permission identity protocol, that should be like an open source, like maintained standard. And so I think we won't solve AI alignment and therefore potentially have a risk to humanity in our existence, if I'm going to dramatize it, if we don't like solve this problem. So it gives me like a lot of motivation actually to want to solve this problem. I'm like, yeah, someday I want grandkids that are alive and AI helps them, not hurts them. Yeah, I can get behind that. Okay, one last question, which I think is between two. So there's the open source one, or we could talk about belief versioning. Which one would you guys want to pick? Deen, do you got a strong preference?
Yeah, we kind of talked about the open source a bit last time.
Yeah, we did.
Belief versioning, that can mean so many different things. So let's dive into
let's
that.
talk about that. Do you want to kick us off? Because you did mention versioning before of beliefs, so maybe just elaborate on even what you mean by that, and that can kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it deeply relates to the concept of the self. We were alluding to this earlier, right? Like early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein have different beliefs, and there's a progression of beliefs that may have evolved from one belief into another. So there's a philosophical problem there of saying like, oh, is one belief, if it's slightly modified, is it a version of the other belief or is it a new belief entirely? That's like a computer science problem of like mutability and immutability. There's different ways to model that. But, you can make the claim that one belief that you have gets versioned over time and gets updated to become a new belief. And then, if I wanted to understand, and then you can even assign the concept of temporality, right? You could say that, I had this old belief from 2024 to 2025. I have this new belief from 2025 2026. I don't know why I put it 2 years and projected 2 years out. But then you could also say that, given some timestamp, like, hey, here's me. I want to send like, what did I look like in 2024? I could send that timestamp and it would pull all my beliefs and it would generate the belief system from that point in time. So I could use this temporality and versioning to understand myself at different points in time. And that's important, I think, because we're living and breathing organisms, right? That's one of the teachings of like, that's one of the things that you could gain from predictive processing, Buddhism, whatever. There is no self. That's one thing. It's changing all the time. It's interacting with many different things. So I think that concept of versioning or temporality is important and needs to exist in the system, because the self obviously changes over time.
Well said, Dean. Jonathan, do you want to add your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's an important concept at a few levels. I think Dean just did a great job describing many of them. I think about like version beliefs as also just helping a user with a self model is the construct that you use in Epistemic Me. And so if we're taking somebody through a process where we're extracting their belief statements and then helping them shape those into falsifiable beliefs, that jump right there where they have to make something falsifiable may actually help them question their beliefs in a way that is constructive, and it involves the beliefs there. And then further, when you start to evidence those falsifiable beliefs, maybe that's a point where it's like the beliefs themselves get updated. And during all those, we want to see the version changes and sort of like, how are we growing? And you can look at that as learning, in the system, the belief system and the structure it creates, the ontology that we generate from it, it's all like, this is a learning process. And so then you get sort of a meta learning as we version beliefs within that sort of ontological structure. And so I think it's just practical to think about building applications where you can see learning through self models, as you're working with users, and that's practical. And then I think from a philosophical standpoint, and we, as we sort of deconstruct what self means, that these ideas of being and becoming, are sort of part of our journeys, and that we have a set of beliefs that we can apply at a specific time that are suited for an environment that we're in. And they're going to have their own version updates as we're like, as we're being something in the world. But then as in your becoming, as you sort of like, move through life, you make these kind of phase shifts where you might even have underlying principled beliefs that will shift significantly and give you the tools that you need for a new sort of like version of yourself as you're growing. And I think that these are practical and helpful ways to talk about what it means to be alive, to be a self. And, that the underlying flexibility of version beliefs is just kind of like one of the tools that we've thought about to help steward that.
Time series belief data. That's cool. So I threw this like topic in our podcast agenda because I actually, before even meeting Jonathan and Dean, I have created my own document of my beliefs and my values. And I've versioned it over time as I learned new things, and like I've evolved like a Pokemon almost, right? So I have a change log where I keep some, hey, I've added a new thing or I changed a thing. And one of the things I personally would love to do, founding this is like, I would love if I just had a representation of myself that I could look at and examine my belief evolution. Like I take my document and then back it into like do a data conversion, put it into Epistemic Me, and I have model of self Robert. And then I could just maybe hook it up to my Obsidian journal, my note-taking apps, and then perhaps that evolves over time. It auto-detects changes. And then that would be a great tool that I could leverage and like bring to therapy, honestly, with me. Another thing that I was thinking of, I have so many thoughts going on right now from what you guys said, but one at a time. One thing I think about, because you guys like have worked at different companies before, and right now, Dean, you're working on like a transformation project, right? So like a lot of that, like changing the way that we work on things, like an organization of humans working together, a lot of them just, people love hanging on to the beliefs. That's definitely something that I have figured out in life. It's rare that a person like really wants to lean in to constantly evolve their beliefs. I actually find that to be kind of rare, which is why I like you two, and we're building this together. But I have noticed for like the topic of change management and transformation, one thing that I was thinking of as we were talking about the evolution of beliefs and time series belief data, if I owned like, I don't know, Salesforce as a company, I was the CEO, and I'm like trying to institute some new transformative project, like we're going to work in a different way. We got to, consolidate our tech stack, whatever it might be. It'll take a lot of change. And typically change management to me is actually where a lot of transformation projects fail, where you get a lot of humans to just change the way they work. And I wonder if there's like, usually people will like hire a consulting company that comes in, they do some change management, they waste a bunch of money. Nobody feels good about it. The consultants makes a bunch of money. Maybe they feel good about it. But like, what if there was a way to like do a before we do, give this Epistemic Me like in a quiz about how you think about a certain technology or this transformation that's to happen. And then we take a litmus test. I don't know how that might look, but then we do an after. There's an implementation, then we do an after, and we do a litmus test again, and then we show that to like the CEO of Salesforce, like Mark Benioff, and be like, here's a report of like the proxied culture change in quantified evolution of belief change in your org. Random thought, but like, do you guys, I don't know, like, are you guys, I'm kind of riffing, but like, does this make sense? Like, would this be useful in any capacity? Like in my head, it is, but just throwing it out there.
Sounds like you want an independent auditor that can perform some kind of experiment, right? So it starts off with a hypothesis, analyzes the state of the world.
I think in this case, what I'm saying is like, it's a very hard hypothesis to falsify. Like there's very difficult metrics to say you've changed culture, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to tie to is like, can we demonstrate culture change by quantifying time series belief changes, right?
I think we could, yeah. Yeah, it would sound pretty ambitious. But yeah, basically if you have every employee working with their belief system in some way, it's kind of like some of those like automated, those surveys that companies send out to like assess employee well-being, and instead of
do that right now.
Yeah, you could, that's a really good idea. You could use a more dynamical system to assess employee well-being and what they think about a company, and then diff that over time and check out progress trends and the overall health of a company. And I could even see that being a tool that a company wants to use just to better understand themselves, not for a specific project, right? You could run it global system and then isolate it to given projects and understand your org chart in a certain way.
Actually, you're right. Like every company that is in the Fortune 1000 runs employee sentiment surveys. Like I'm positive at least 90% of them do, because I work in HR software myself and I have worked in that for a long time. That's an interesting use case. I'll have to noodle on that more. But yeah, just to close things out, we talked about, project updates, a lot of exciting things. By the time you hear this podcast, viewers, we're going to have things live, and you could join our community as a contributor to Epistemic Me. And we have lots more in the pipeline in January 2025 and the rest of the next year with, Epistemic Me, the base layer open source SDK project, and with applications we aim to go to market with and design. So if you're interested in any of that, definitely sign up for our newsletter and subscribe to our podcast.
Maybe also just like the kind of contributors we're looking for. Like, yeah, we also have a backend in Go. We have SDKs and TypeScript, some work in progress ones in Python and Go. So like across the whole stack, if you know any of those languages or interested in working across the stack, like we would love contributors across all those things.
Yeah. If you are interested in nerding out about the world, like we are on this podcast, and you want to work with like-minded deep thinkers and tinkerers that want to build the future, totally hit us up. We'll have links all over the place. Go to any of them and you'll be able to reach out and join the project. As Deen said, we're looking for expertise across the board. I'd also say even beyond technical implementation expertise, it'd be lovely to have like practitioners or academic researchers or scientists working in like the fields of neuroscience or metaphysics, even biology, like psychiatry, psychology, to like advise us. We are looking to form an advisory council. So that'll be an undertaking in Q1. So if you're interested in that, either being an advisor, just getting project updates, being able to give your opinions, or you actually want to be a technical contributor, we have paths for both. So you'll see some of that on our launch and on our website. So that's exciting. So every podcast, we're going to give updates about the project, our ventures. We're really going for a build in the open strategy where we're just super open about everything we're doing, our decision-making, our thinking behind things, our timing, how we're thinking about design. It's all of that. So we're a really open team. We believe in building in the open, especially for something like this, which can help humanity at a large scale in the future. We really want to make that happen. So if you got questions for us on like our technical implementation or our direction for Epistemic Me, feel free to drop us a line. We have our contact in the GitHub and on our website. So this has been ABCs for Building the Future, one of our intro podcasts. And hopefully after this, you got to know us a little bit better and some of the books we like. We'll add that to the show notes, some updates on the project, where we see success looking like in 10 years, if we have unlimited budget, et cetera. Hopefully you've had fun with us. We've had a lot of fun making this. Thanks a lot, and tune in next time. Thanks a lot. Take care, guys.